The hour was late, and the Virginia air pressed heavy against the earth, thick with the scent of rain and the hush of secrets. In the farthest corner of the Carter plantation, where the fields gave way to tangled woods, a single candle burned in defiance of the darkness. Its flickering light revealed a man hunched over a battered table, his face drawn and intent, the shadows deepening the lines of worry etched into his brow. His name was Josiah Henson, and tonight he was gambling with fate. Outside, the world was silent but for the distant rumble of thunder and the restless shifting of the wind through the cotton. The great house, with its white columns and polished windows, stood aloof on the hill, a monument to power and pretense. But here, in the cramped, mud-chinked cabin that Josiah shared with his wife and children, the air was alive with something far more dangerous than any storm: the possibility of being heard, of being found out, of being free. Josiah's hands trembled as he dipped the quill into the ink, the motion careful, almost reverent. He had seen what happened to those who dared to write, how a single word could be a death sentence, how a scrap of paper could mean the difference between hope and horror. Yet tonight he could not help himself. The words pressed against his chest, urgent and insistent, demanding to be set loose. He wrote not as a slave, but as a father, a husband, a man who refused to let his story be swallowed by silence. "My name is Josiah," he began, the letters uneven but determined. "I was born in chains, but I have not forgotten how to dream." He wrote of Sarah, his wife, whose laughter had once filled the cabin with light, and of their children, whose futures seemed to shrink with every passing year. He wrote of the fields, endless and unyielding, and of the overseer's shadow that stretched long across every waking moment. He wrote of the songs they sang at dusk, songs that carried secrets in their melodies, directions, warnings, promises of a world beyond the river. But Josiah's letter was more than a confession, it was a reckoning. He described the small mercies that made life bearable: a stolen moment of rest beneath the sycamore, a crust of bread shared in the dark, the way Sarah would press her hand to his back when the night grew too long. He wrote of the pain, too, the scars that never faded, the names of friends sold away, the memory of his mother's voice fading into the past. Each word was a thread, weaving together the fragments of a life lived in the shadow of someone else's will. He paused, listening. The only sound was the slow, steady breathing of his children, curled together on a straw pallet in the corner. He wondered if they dreamed of freedom, or if the world had already taught them not to dream at all. He pressed on, the candle burning lower, the ink running thin. If this letter finds its way to the world beyond these fields, let it be known that I am a man, that I have loved and lost and hoped, that I have seen the face of cruelty, and still I choose to speak. When the letter was finished, Josiah folded it with trembling hands, tucking it into the lining of his worn coat. He knew the risk, knew that discovery meant the whip, the auction block, or worse. But he also knew that silence was its own kind of death, a slow erasure that left nothing behind but dust and rumor. He would not let his children inherit only silence. The next day dawned gray and uncertain. Josiah moved through his chores with the practiced caution of a man who had learned to make himself invisible. At midday, when the overseer's attention was elsewhere, he slipped away to the edge of the woods. There, beneath the twisted limbs of an ancient oak, he met Mary, the housemaid, whose loyalty had been tested 100 times and never found wanting. She took the letter without a word, her eyes meeting his in a moment of silent understanding. They both knew what was at stake. They both knew that some truths were too heavy to carry alone. Mary's journey was a story in itself, a gauntlet of suspicion and danger, of whispered passwords and hidden doors. She moved by night, guided by the invisible hand of the Underground Railroad, trusting strangers whose names she would never know. At each stop, Josiah's letter changed hands, passed from one brave soul to the next, a preacher with a scar on his cheek, a school teacher who hid abolitionist pamphlets in her Bible, a free black man who had once run these same woods with shackles on his ankles. Each risks everything for a letter they could not read, but whose weight they understood. When at last the letter reached Philadelphia, it landed in the hands of a publisher whose conscience warred with his fear. The words were too raw, too real, too dangerous. They threatened to shatter the fragile peace of a nation built on compromise and denial. The publisher, trembling, locked the letter away, vowing to keep it hidden until the world was ready to face itself in the mirror of Josiah's truth. The unveiling of Josiah's letter did not happen with fanfare or celebration. It was a quiet event, almost accidental, as if history itself was reluctant to let go of its secrets. In the spring of 1952, a young archivist named Ruth Ellison was cataloging the private collection of a long-dead abolitionist family in Philadelphia. The house was a mausoleum of memory, dusty trunks, faded daguerreotypes, and boxes of brittle correspondence. Ruth worked in silence, her only company the ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant hum of city traffic. She had no reason to expect that this day would be different from any other. But as she sifted through a stack of yellowed papers, her fingers brushed against something unusual, a small oilskin-wrapped bundle tied with a faded blue ribbon. The bundle was heavier than it looked, and when she untied it, a single folded letter fell into her lap. The ink was brown with age, the paper soft as cloth. Ruth unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as she read the first line. "My name is Josiah. I was born in chains, but I have not forgotten how to dream." She read the letter once, then again, her heart pounding. The words seemed to pulse with life, as if Josiah himself were standing beside her, whispering his story into her ear. She felt the weight of his hope, the ache of his longing, the quiet fury that burned beneath every line. She read of Sarah and the children, of the fields and the songs, of the small, stubborn acts of kindness that made survival possible. She read of the risk, the fear, the unbreakable will to be heard. Ruth knew, even as she finished the letter, that she was holding something dangerous. The world had changed since Josiah's time, but not enough. There were still those who would rather forget, who would rather the past remain buried. She thought of her own grandfather, who had come north from Georgia with nothing but a suitcase and a head full of stories he never told. She thought of the faces she saw every day on the city streets, faces marked by struggle and pride, by the memory of things lost and things reclaimed. She brought the letter to her supervisor, a stooped, white-haired man named Samuelson, who had spent his life piecing together the fragments of other people's histories. He read the letter in silence, his lips moving as he traced each word with a trembling finger. When he finished, he looked up at Ruth, his eyes shining with something like awe. "This," he said softly, "is a voice we were never meant to hear." The decision to publish the letter was not made lightly. There were meetings, debates, arguments that stretched late into the night. Some feared the backlash, the reopening of old wounds. Others argued that the truth, once found, could not be hidden again. In the end, it was Josiah's own words that decided the matter. "If this letter finds its way to the world beyond these fields, let it be known that I am a man. To deny him that was to become complicit in the very silence he had risked everything to break." The letter was published in a small academic journal, its impact immediate and electric. Historians pored over every line, searching for clues to Josiah's identity, to the fate of his family, to the network of hands that had carried his words across a century.
activists seized upon the letter as proof of the enduring power of resistance, of the ways in which even the most marginalized voices could shape the course of history. For many, the letter was a revelation, a window into a world that had always been there, just out of sight. But not everyone welcomed Josiah's voice. In the South, old resentments flared. Newspapers denounced the letter as a fabrication, a northern plot to stir up trouble. Politicians called for investigations, for the letter to be discredited and forgotten. In some quarters, the mere existence of Josiah's words was seen as a threat, a challenge to the carefully constructed myths that had long held sway. But the letter could not be unread. It spread, quietly at first, then with gathering force, passed from hand to hand, discussed in classrooms and church basements, debated in living rooms and on street corners. For those who had lived their lives in the shadow of history, Josiah's letter was a kind of vindication, a reminder that their stories mattered, that their pain and their hope were not invisible. In the months that followed, Ruth found herself drawn deeper into Josiah's world. She traveled to Virginia, tracing the faint outlines of the Carter plantation, now little more than a memory beneath the relentless march of time. She walked the fields where Josiah had labored, stood beneath the oak where he had entrusted his letter to Mary. She spoke with descendants of slaves and slaveholders alike, piecing together the fragments of a story that had nearly been lost. Everywhere she went, she found echoes of Josiah's courage, in the weathered face of an old woman who remembered her grandmother's stories of the man who wrote, in the faded photograph of a child with eyes too wise for his years, in the hush that fell over a room when she read the letter aloud. The past, she realized, was never truly gone. It lived on in the stories we told, in the silences we kept, in the letters we dared to write. And as the world grappled with the meaning of Josiah's words, Ruth understood that the true power of the letter was not in its survival, but in its refusal to be silenced. It was a testament to the endurance of hope, to the stubborn insistence that every life, no matter how circumscribed by circumstance, could leave a mark on the world. Josiah had written his truth into the darkness, never knowing if it would be found. Now, at last, the world was listening.
The story of Josiah's letter began to ripple outward, unsettling the surface of American memory. In the months after its publication, scholars and journalists descended on the archives, eager to trace the letter's journey and the man behind it. The Carter plantation, once a symbol of Southern prosperity, became a site of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the tangled roots of the nation's past. Yet, for all the attention, the heart of the story remained elusive, a single voice, trembling but unbroken, echoing across the years. Ruth Ellison, now recognized as the letter's discoverer, found herself at the center of a growing storm. She was invited to speak at universities, to appear on radio programs, and to consult on documentaries. Each time she carried with her a copy of Josiah's letter, its words worn soft by repeated readings. She never tired of sharing it, never ceased to marvel at the courage it represented. But she also felt the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that she was now a steward of someone else's pain and hope. In one packed auditorium, Ruth stood before a sea of faces, students, professors, descendants of slaves and slaveholders alike. She read Josiah's words aloud, her voice steady but thick with emotion. As she finished, a hush fell over the room, broken only by the sound of someone quietly weeping in the back row. Later, a young man approached her, his hands shaking as he thanked her for giving voice to a history he had only ever glimpsed in fragments. "It's like hearing my own grandfather speak," he said, and Ruth understood that Josiah's letter was more than a relic. It was a bridge, spanning the gulf between past and present, between silence and speech.
The letter's impact was not confined to academia. In churches across the country, pastors wove Josiah's words into their sermons, drawing parallels between his struggle and the ongoing fight for justice. In classrooms, teachers used the letter to spark difficult conversations about race, power, and the legacy of slavery. For many students, it was the first time they had encountered a first-hand account of bondage that was not filtered through the lens of textbooks or Hollywood. Josiah's voice was raw, immediate, impossible to ignore. Yet, as the letter gained prominence, it also attracted controversy. In the South, some communities reacted with anger and denial. Local newspapers published editorials dismissing the letter as a forgery, a Northern invention designed to stir up old animosities. Descendants of the Carter family, whose name was now forever linked to Josiah's story, issued statements distancing themselves from the past. We cannot be held responsible for the actions of our ancestors, nor should we be judged by the words of a man whose very existence is in doubt. But the evidence was overwhelming. Historians traced the letter's provenance through a chain of abolitionist families, each link supported by diaries, receipts, and oral histories. Linguists analyzed the handwriting, confirming its authenticity. Genealogists uncovered records of Josiah Henson, a man whose life, though marked by hardship, had left a faint but indelible trace in the census rolls and church registers of Virginia. The more the letter was scrutinized, the more real Josiah became, his story refusing to be erased. For Ruth, the journey was both exhilarating and exhausting. She spent long nights poring over microfilm, chasing down leads, interviewing anyone who might remember a scrap of the past. She learned to navigate the delicate politics of memory, to listen as much as she spoke. In the process, she discovered that Josiah's story was not unique. Across the South, in towns and cities and forgotten crossroads, there were other letters, other voices, other acts of quiet defiance waiting to be found. One evening, Ruth sat with an elderly woman named Leela, whose grandmother had been born on the Carter plantation. Leela's hands were gnarled with age, her eyes sharp and unblinking. She listened as Ruth read Josiah's letter, then nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to tell us stories," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said there was a man who could write, who wrote things down so they wouldn't be lost. She said he was brave, but also afraid. She said he wanted the world to know he was more than what they called him." Ruth asked if Leela remembered any of the stories. Leela shook her head. "They were just whispers, you know, things you said when the doors were closed and the night was dark. But I remember the way my grandmother's voice changed when she spoke of him, like she was proud, but also sad, like she knew the cost of telling the truth." The cost was real. For every Josiah who found a way to speak, there were countless others whose voices were silenced before they could be heard. Letters burned, stories forgotten, names erased from the record. The discovery of Josiah's letter was a miracle, but it was also a reminder of all that had been lost. Ruth carried that knowledge with her, a quiet ache that never quite faded. As the months passed, the letter became a touchstone for a nation grappling with its own history. It was cited in debates over reparations, in arguments about the teaching of slavery in schools, and in discussions of what it meant to be American. For some, it was a source of pride, a testament to the resilience of those who had endured. For others, it was a provocation, a challenge to the stories they had been told about themselves and their country. Through it all, Josiah's words endured. They were read at weddings and funerals, at protests and vigils, in moments of joy and sorrow. They became a kind of prayer, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the act of speaking, of refusing to be silenced, was itself a form of hope. The letter's journey from Josiah's trembling hand to the world's gaze was not just a passage through time, but a transformation of meaning. Each generation that encountered his words found in them a mirror, reflecting their own struggles and aspirations. In the 1960s, as the civil rights movement swept across America, Josiah's letter was rediscovered by a new wave of activists. It was read aloud at rallies in Selma and Montgomery, its phrases echoing through church basements and city squares. The cadence of Josiah's plea, "Let it be known that I am a man," became a rallying cry, a simple truth that cut through the noise of politics and prejudice. For many, the letter was a revelation. It was not the voice of a victim, but of a survivor, a man who had endured the worst the world could offer and still found the courage to speak. His words were not just a record of suffering, but a testament to the power of dignity and self-assertion. In classrooms, teachers used the letter to challenge students' assumptions, to force them to confront the realities of slavery, not as an abstract evil, but as a lived experience. Students wrote essays, staged plays, and composed songs inspired by Josiah's story. The letter became a living document, its meaning renewed with each retelling. Yet the letter's power was not without its dangers. In some communities, its presence was seen as a threat, a challenge to the carefully maintained silence that had allowed old wounds to fester. There were attempts to ban the letter from school curricula, to remove it from library shelves. In one small town, a group of parents petitioned the school board to have the letter burned, arguing that it was divisive and un-American. The debate was fierce, pitting neighbor against neighbor, teacher against administrator. In the end, the letter survived, but only just. Its continued existence was a testament to the stubbornness of those who believed that the truth, however painful, was worth preserving. For Ruth Ellison, the controversy was both exhausting and invigorating. She traveled from town to town, speaking at school board meetings, appearing on local radio shows, writing op-eds for newspapers large and small. She became, almost against her will, the public face of Josiah's legacy. She was threatened, praised, ignored, and celebrated in equal measure. Through it all, she clung to the letter, reading it aloud whenever she could, letting Josiah's words speak for themselves. One evening, after a particularly heated meeting, Ruth found herself sitting alone in a diner on the outskirts of town. The waitress, a young black woman with tired eyes, recognized her from the news. She brought Ruth a cup of coffee, then hesitated before speaking. "My grandmother used to talk about a man who wrote a letter," she said, quietly. "It was dangerous, but important. She said it made her feel like she wasn't alone." Ruth smiled, feeling the weight of exhaustion lift, if only for a moment. "That's why I keep fighting, so no one has to feel alone." The letter's influence continued to grow, reaching far beyond the borders of the United States. In South Africa, activists fighting against apartheid found inspiration in Josiah's words. In India, Dalit writers cited the letter as an example of the power of testimony. In Ireland, poets drew parallels between Josiah's struggle and their own history of colonization and resistance. The letter became a global symbol, its message of dignity and defiance resonating across cultures and continents. But for all its impact, the letter remained, at its core, a deeply personal document. It was the story of one man, written in the quiet hours of the night, in a world that had done everything it could to silence him. It was a love letter to his family, a plea for recognition, a record of hope in the face of despair. It was, as Ruth often said, a reminder that history is made not just by great events, but by the choices of ordinary people. As the years passed, new generations discovered the letter, each finding in it something different. For some, it was a call to action. For others, a source of comfort. For many, it was a challenge, a demand to confront the past honestly, to reckon with the legacies of injustice that still shaped their lives. The letter was read at graduations and memorials, at protests and prayer meetings, in moments of triumph and defeat. It became a touchstone, a way of measuring the distance between what was and what could be. In the end, the letter's greatest power was not in the story it told, but in the stories it inspired. People who had never thought of themselves as writers began to put pen to paper, to record their own experiences, their own hopes and fears. Letters poured in to Ruth from across the country, letters from prisoners, from teachers, from children who had read Josiah's words and found in them the courage to speak. Each letter was a thread, weaving a tapestry of voices that stretched across time and space. Ruth kept every letter she received, storing them in boxes beneath her bed. She read them on sleepless nights, drawing strength from the knowledge that Josiah's legacy was alive and growing. She knew that the work was far from finished, that the world was still full of silences waiting to be broken. But she also knew that thanks to one man's courage, the darkness was a little less complete.
As the decades rolled on, the story of Josiah's letter became woven into the fabric of American consciousness, yet it never lost its edge. Each time the letter was read aloud, whether in a crowded auditorium or a quiet living room, it seemed to gather new meaning, as if Josiah's spirit lingered in the spaces between the words. The letter was not just a relic of the past, but a living challenge to the present, a reminder that the struggle for dignity and truth was never truly finished. In the 1980s, a new generation of scholars began to revisit Josiah's letter, bringing with them fresh questions and new perspectives. They examined the letter not only as a historical document, but as a work of literature, a piece of art forged in the crucible of suffering. Literary critics marveled at the letter's structure, the way Josiah wove together memory and hope, pain and resilience in sentences that seemed to pulse with life. They compared his voice to that of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, noting the unique blend of humility and defiance that set his words apart. At the same time, historians delved deeper into the context of the letter, seeking to understand the world that had shaped Josiah's experience. They pored over plantation records, census data, and oral histories, reconstructing the daily realities of life in antebellum Virginia. They traced the routes of the Underground Railroad, mapping the networks of resistance that had made Josiah's act of writing possible. In doing so, they uncovered a hidden world of courage and solidarity, a world in which ordinary people risked everything to help one another, to keep hope alive in the face of overwhelming odds. The more they learned, the more remarkable Josiah's letter seemed. It was not just a cry of pain, but a blueprint for survival, a testament to how enslaved people carved out spaces of autonomy and meaning within a system designed to crush them. Josiah's descriptions of secret gatherings, coded songs, and whispered prayers revealed a world of resistance that had long been overlooked by mainstream history. His letter became a key text in the emerging field of slave studies, cited in countless books and articles as evidence of the complexity and humanity of those who had been enslaved. But the letter's influence was not confined to the academy. In the streets, in churches, in community centers, people continued to find inspiration in Josiah's words. Activists fighting for justice in the present drew strength from his example, seeing in his story a reflection of their own struggles. The letter was read at rallies against police brutality, at vigils for victims of hate crimes, at marches for immigrant rights. Each time it served as a reminder that the fight for freedom was ongoing, that the past was never as distant as it seemed. For Ruth Ellison, now older and grayer, the letter remained a touchstone. She had retired from her job at the archives, but she continued to speak about Josiah whenever she was invited.
She traveled to schools and prisons, to universities and community centers, carrying with her a battered folder containing the original letter and the hundreds of responses it had inspired. She saw herself as a caretaker, not just of Josiah's words, but of the hope they represented. One afternoon, Ruth visited a high school in Richmond, Virginia, not far from where Josiah had lived and labored. The students were restless, skeptical, their attention divided between their phones and the world outside the classroom window. But as Ruth began to read Josiah's letter, a hush fell over the room. The students listened, rapt, as she spoke of the fields and the songs, of the risks and the dreams. When she finished, a young woman in the back row raised her hand. "Do you think Josiah ever knew his letter would matter this much?" she asked. Ruth smiled, her eyes shining. "I think Josiah wrote because he had to, because silence was no longer an option. He couldn't have known what would happen, but he believed that the truth was worth telling, no matter the cost. And that's what makes his letter so powerful. It's not just about the past, it's about the choices we make now, the risks we're willing to take for what we believe in." The students nodded, some thoughtful, others visibly moved. After the class, several stayed behind to thank Ruth, to ask more questions, to share their own stories. One young man, his voice barely above a whisper, told her about his father's struggles with discrimination, about how Josiah's words had given him hope. Ruth listened, her heart full, knowing that the letter's journey was far from over. Outside, the world continued to change. New challenges arose, new injustices demanded attention. But through it all, Josiah's letter remained, a beacon, a warning, a promise. It reminded those who read it that history was not just something to be studied, but something to be lived, to be shaped by the choices of ordinary people. It was a call to action, a plea for empathy, a testament to the enduring power of the written word.
In the years that followed, Josiah's letter continued to ripple outward, its influence growing in ways both visible and unseen. It became a fixture in university syllabi, a subject of scholarly conferences, and a touchstone for artists and writers seeking to grapple with the legacy of slavery. Museums displayed facsimiles of the letter alongside artifacts from the era, iron shackles, battered hymnals, faded photographs, inviting visitors to imagine the world from which Josiah's words had emerged. For many, the letter was a revelation, a window into a history that was at once distant and intimately present. Yet, for all its public acclaim, the letter retained a private, almost sacred quality. Those who read it often described a sense of intimacy, as if Josiah were speaking directly to them across the gulf of years. His words, stripped of pretense or artifice, carried the weight of lived experience, the ache of longing, the sting of loss, the stubborn flicker of hope. Readers found themselves drawn into his world, compelled to bear witness to his pain and his courage. Among those most deeply affected were the descendants of enslaved people, for whom the letter was both a source of pride and a reminder of wounds that had never fully healed. Family reunions became occasions for reading Josiah's words aloud, for sharing stories that had been passed down in whispers and fragments. Elders spoke of ancestors who had risked everything for a chance at freedom, of mothers who had taught their children to read in secret, of fathers who had vanished into the night, never to return. The letter became a thread connecting generations, a way of honoring those whose names had been lost to history. But the letter also resonated with those whose ancestors had stood on the other side of the divide. Some descendants of slaveholders found themselves unsettled by Josiah's words, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own family histories. For a few, the letter sparked a journey of reckoning, a search for understanding, for atonement, for a way to make peace with the past. They reached out to Ruth, to scholars, to community leaders,
seeking guidance on how to honor Josiah's legacy. Some became advocates for racial justice, using their privilege to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. The letter's power lay in its refusal to offer easy answers. It did not traffic in blame or self-pity, nor did it shy away from the horrors of the past. Instead, it demanded honesty, a willingness to look unflinchingly at the realities of slavery, to acknowledge the ways in which its legacy continued to shape the present. For many, this was a painful process, marked by anger, grief, and confusion. But it was also a process of healing, of forging new connections across lines of race and history. As the new millennium dawned, Josiah's letter found fresh relevance in a world grappling with old and new forms of injustice. In the wake of tragedies and reckonings, activists invoked his words in calls for police reform, for reparations, for the removal of monuments that glorified the Confederacy. The letter was quoted in op-eds and social media posts, its phrases hashtagged and retweeted by a generation determined to make their voices heard. For many young people, Josiah's story was a reminder that the fight for justice was not a sprint, but a relay, a struggle passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart. Ruth, now in her twilight years, watched with a mixture of pride and humility as Josiah's legacy continued to grow. She received invitations to speak at events she could no longer attend, her health too fragile for travel. But she remained a presence in the movement, her words carried by those she had inspired. She mentored a new generation of scholars and activists, encouraging them to dig deeper, to ask harder questions, to listen for the voices that history had tried to silence. One of Ruth's protégés, a young historian named Marcus, took up the task of tracing the letter's journey in even greater detail. He traveled to the towns and cities where the letter had passed, interviewing descendants, poring over church records, searching for any scrap of evidence that might shed light on Josiah's fate. In the process, Marcus uncovered new stories of men and women who had risked everything to carry the letter north, of abolitionists who had sheltered Josiah's family, of children who had grown up hearing tales of the man who wrote. Marcus's research culminated in a book that wove together Josiah's story with those of the people who had helped him. The book was hailed as a masterpiece, praised for its empathy and rigor, its refusal to reduce history to simple villains and heroes. In interviews, Marcus spoke of the responsibility he felt to honor Josiah's voice, to ensure that the letter was never again consigned to darkness. History, he said, is not just about what happened, it's about who gets to tell the story and whose stories are allowed to be heard.
The world around Josiah's letter continued to evolve, but the document itself remained unchanged, a fixed point in a shifting landscape. Its words, penned in the hush of a Virginia night, had outlasted empires and ideologies, wars and reconciliations, yet each new era found in the letter a different meaning, a new urgency. In the early 21st century, as debates over history and memory intensified, Josiah's letter became a lightning rod for conversations about truth, reconciliation, and the unfinished business of justice. In classrooms, teachers found that the letter could break through the apathy and cynicism that sometimes clouded discussions of the past. Students who had grown up surrounded by digital noise were struck by the immediacy of Josiah's voice, by the rawness of his longing, and the clarity of his vision. They debated the risks he had taken, the choices he had made, the world he had imagined for his children. Some wrote essays comparing Josiah's letter to modern-day testimonies of injustice, drawing lines from the plantation fields of Virginia to the streets of Ferguson and Minneapolis. Others created art, paintings, poems, short films, seeking to capture the spirit of resistance that animated Josiah's words. In one high school, a group of students staged a dramatic reading of the letter, each taking turns to voice a different passage. The performance ended with a moment of silence, the audience left to contemplate the courage it took to write such words in a world built on silence. Afterward, a teacher remarked that she had never seen her students so moved by a piece of history. "It's as if Josiah is still speaking to us," she said, reminding us that the past is never really past. Outside the classroom, the letter continued to spark debate. In city councils and state legislatures, activists cited Josiah's words in arguments for reparations and educational reform. Some politicians embraced the letter as a symbol of American resilience, while others dismissed it as a relic of a bygone era. The letter was invoked in lawsuits over the teaching of slavery, in campaigns to rename schools and streets, in efforts to preserve or remove monuments. Each time, it forced communities to confront the question, whose history do we honor? Whose voices do we choose to remember?
For some, the letter was a source of pride, a testament to the endurance of those who had survived the worst the world could offer. For others, it was a provocation, a challenge to the comforting myths that had long shaped their sense of identity. In one southern town, a proposal to erect a statue honoring Josiah sparked weeks of heated debate. Supporters argued that the statue would serve as a reminder of the region's complex history, a tribute to the power of truth-telling. Opponents insisted that it would only reopen old wounds, that the past was best left undisturbed. In the end, the statue was never built, but the conversation it sparked lingered, a sign that Josiah's letter still had the power to unsettle and inspire. Meanwhile, the letter continued to travel, both physically and metaphorically. It was displayed in museums and libraries, loaned to exhibitions in cities across the country and around the world. Each time it was shown, crowds gathered to read the faded lines, to imagine the hand that had written them, the life that had shaped them. Some visitors wept openly, others stood in silent contemplation. Many left notes in the guest book, messages of gratitude and reflection, promises to remember and to act. Among those most deeply affected were the descendants of Josiah's family, who had grown up hearing stories of the man who wrote. For them, the letter was both a source of pride and a burden, a reminder of the courage it took to speak and of the silence that had followed. Some became activists, carrying on Josiah's legacy in their own work. Others chose quieter paths, honoring his memory in private ways. All felt the weight of his words, the responsibility to ensure that his story was not forgotten. Ruth Ellison, now in her 90s, watched from afar as the letter continued its journey. She received letters and emails from people around the world, each sharing their own connection to Josiah's story. Some wrote of their own struggles with injustice, others simply wanted to say thank you. Ruth replied to as many as she could, her responses growing shorter as her strength waned. She took comfort in knowing that the work she had begun would continue, that Josiah's voice would not be silenced again. In her final years, Ruth entrusted the original letter and her collection of correspondence to a museum dedicated to the history of resistance. She wrote a brief note to accompany the donation. "This letter belongs to all of us. May it continue to speak, to challenge, to inspire." The museum staff treated the letter with reverence, displaying it in a climate-controlled case, surrounded by the stories of those who had fought for freedom in every generation. Visitors to the exhibit often lingered before Josiah's letter, reading and rereading the lines, tracing the faded ink with their eyes.
Some left flowers or small tokens, others simply stood in silence. For many, the letter was a revelation, a reminder that history was not just a record of what had been, but a call to imagine what could be. In the quiet of the museum, Josiah's words continued to echo, a whisper from the past that refused to fade. As the 21st century unfolded, Josiah's letter became more than a historical artifact. It became a living force, shaping conversations and inspiring action in ways that even its author could never have imagined. The letter's journey from a candlelit cabin in Virginia to the glass cases of a modern museum was now the subject of documentaries, podcasts, and even a feature film. Each retelling brought new voices into the conversation, each interpretation adding another layer to the story's meaning. In one such documentary, filmmakers traced the letter's path across generations, interviewing descendants, historians, and activists. The film opened with a close-up of the letter itself, the camera lingering on the faded script, the uneven lines, the places where Josiah's hand had pressed too hard or hesitated. Over this image, the narrator's voice intoned, "This is not just a letter, it is a map, a record of one man's journey through darkness and a guide for those who would follow." The documentary wove together archival footage, reenactments, and interviews, creating a tapestry of memory and hope. The film's release sparked renewed interest in Josiah's story. Book clubs and discussion groups sprang up across the country, each gathering to read and reflect on the letter's message. In one city, a group of high school students organized a public reading of the letter in the town square, inviting community members to share their own stories of struggle and resilience. The event drew a diverse crowd, young and old, black and white, newcomers and lifelong residents. As the students read Josiah's words aloud, the crowd fell silent, united in a moment of shared remembrance. For many, the letter's power lay in its honesty. Josiah did not shy away from the pain of his experience, nor did he seek to cast himself as a hero. He wrote of fear and doubt, of moments when hope seemed impossible. Yet he also wrote of love, of the bonds that sustained him, the dreams that refused to die. His letter was a testament to the complexity of the human spirit, to how suffering and joy could coexist even in the harshest of circumstances. The letter also became a touchstone for new justice movements. In the wake of protests against racial violence and inequality, activists invoked Josiah's words as a reminder of the long arc of struggle. His insistence on being seen as a man, on claiming his humanity in the face of dehumanization, resonated with those fighting for dignity and recognition in the present. The letter was quoted on protest signs, in speeches, and in social media posts that reached millions. Each time, it served as a bridge between past and present, a reminder that the fight for justice was both ancient and urgent. In academic circles, scholars continued to mine the letter for insight. New research uncovered additional details about Josiah's life, records of his family's eventual escape to the North, accounts of his involvement in abolitionist circles, even a photograph believed to show him in his later years. These discoveries added depth to the story, transforming Josiah from a symbol into a fully realized individual. His letter, once dismissed as a curiosity, was now recognized as a foundational text in the study of American history and literature. Yet, for all its public significance, the letter retained a deeply personal resonance. In one family, the tradition of reading Josiah's letter aloud at reunions became a cherished ritual.
Children listened wide-eyed as their elders recited the words, learning not just about the past, but about the values that had sustained their family through generations. In another home, a young woman struggling with her own sense of belonging found solace in Josiah's insistence on his humanity. "He wrote so that he wouldn't be forgotten," she told her mother, "and now I know I'm not alone." The letter's influence extended beyond the borders of the United States. In South America, activists fighting for the rights of indigenous peoples cited Josiah's words in their campaigns. In Europe, scholars drew parallels between his story and those of refugees and migrants seeking safety and dignity. The letter became a symbol of universal longing for freedom, for recognition, for a place in the world. As the years passed, the letter's meaning continued to evolve. New generations brought their own questions, their own struggles to its pages. Some saw in Josiah's story a call to action, others a source of comfort. For all, it was a reminder that history was not just something to be remembered, but something to be made. The letter was a living document, its power undiminished by time. In the quiet of the museum, beneath the soft glow of the display lights, Josiah's letter waited for each new reader. Some approached with reverence, others with curiosity. All left changed, touched by the courage of a man who had dared to write the truth, even when the world was not ready to hear it.
The museum's exhibit, centered on Josiah's letter, became a pilgrimage site for many. School groups arrived by the busload, their teachers preparing them for the gravity of what they were about to encounter. Families came on weekends, some tracing their fingers over the glass, as if hoping to feel the pulse of history beneath their skin. Survivors of other injustices, immigrants, refugees, those who had fled war or persecution, stood quietly before the letter, recognizing in Josiah's words a kinship of spirit, a shared longing for dignity and home. The curators, aware of the letter's power, designed the exhibit to be immersive. Visitors entered through a narrow corridor lined with the sounds of whispered voices, snatches of songs, fragments of prayers, the soft scratch of a quill on paper. The air was cool and still, the lighting subdued. At the heart of the exhibit, Josiah's letter rested in a climate-controlled case illuminated by a single shaft of light. Around it, panels told the story of its journey, the perilous nights on the Underground Railroad, the abolitionists who risked everything to carry it north, the decades it spent hidden in a Philadelphia attic, the moment of its rediscovery. Interactive displays invited visitors to write their own letters, messages to the past, to the future, to those whose stories had never been told. These letters, pinned to a wall that grew more crowded with each passing week, became a living archive of hope and remembrance. Some were brief, a single line or a name. Others were long, confessional, raw with emotion. "I see you," one child wrote. "I hear you." Another, in careful script, "Your courage gives me courage." The museum also hosted regular readings of Josiah's letter, inviting community members to lend their voices to his words. Each reading was different, shaped by the cadence and inflection of the reader, by the mood of the audience, by the events unfolding in the world outside. Sometimes the room was filled with tears, other times with a fierce, defiant energy. After each reading, a space was left for silence, a moment to absorb, to reflect, to honor the act of bearing witness. For the museum staff, the letter was both a treasure and a responsibility. They fielded requests from researchers, journalists, and filmmakers, each eager to tell Josiah's story in a new way. They worked with educators to develop lesson plans, with community leaders to organize dialogues and workshops,
They welcomed descendants of Josiah's family, some of whom traveled great distances to see the letter in person. For these visitors, the experience was often overwhelming, a reunion with a lost ancestor, a chance to reclaim a piece of their own history.
One such visitor was a woman named Gloria, whose great-great-grandmother had been born on the same plantation as Josiah. Gloria had grown up hearing stories of the man who wrote, but had never imagined she would one day stand before his letter. As she read the familiar lines, tears streamed down her face. "He wrote for all of us," she whispered. "He wrote so we wouldn't be forgotten." The museum staff gave her a quiet space to sit, to read, to remember. Later, Gloria left a letter of her own, addressed to Josiah. "Thank you for your courage. Because of you, I know where I come from." The letter's influence continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways both large and small. In a nearby city, a group of formerly incarcerated men formed a writing circle, inspired by Josiah's example. They met weekly in a church basement, sharing their own stories of struggle and survival. For many, it was the first time they had put their experiences into words, the first time they had felt truly seen. Their letters, collected and published in a small anthology, bore witness to the enduring power of testimony. In another community, a teacher used Josiah's letter to spark a conversation about empathy and justice. Her students, many of whom had never heard the story of slavery in such personal terms, responded with a flood of questions and reflections. Some wrote letters to Josiah, others to their own ancestors, still others to the future. The teacher gathered these letters into a book which she shared with parents and colleagues. "This is how we heal," she wrote in the introduction, "by listening, by remembering, by speaking the truth." The museum's exhibit became a model for others around the world. Institutions in Europe, Africa, and Asia reached out for guidance, seeking to create their own spaces for remembrance and dialogue. Josiah's letter, once hidden away in fear, now traveled the globe, its message of courage and hope resonating across cultures and continents. Through it all, the letter remained unchanged, a fragile piece of paper, battered by time but unbroken. Its words, written in the darkness of a Virginia night, continued to shine, a beacon for all who sought to understand the past and to build a more just future.
As the years passed, Josiah's letter became more than a historical document. It became a living testament, a touchstone for those seeking meaning in their own lives. The museum's guest book filled with messages from visitors who had traveled from distant states and countries, each drawn by the promise of connection. Some came to honor ancestors, others to confront the legacy of injustice, and many simply to bear witness. The letter's presence seemed to invite honesty, to draw out confessions and hopes that might otherwise have remained unspoken. One autumn, a group of college students arrived at the museum as part of a seminar on memory and reconciliation. Their professor, a descendant of abolitionists, encouraged them to approach the letter not just as a relic, but as a living voice. The students gathered in a circle around the display, reading the letter aloud, each taking a turn with a paragraph. As they spoke, the words seemed to gather force, echoing off the marble walls and settling into the hearts of all who listened. When they finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the sound of a single student quietly weeping. Afterward, the group sat together in the museum's courtyard, sharing their reactions. Some spoke of anger, at the cruelty Josiah had endured, at the systems that had tried to erase his voice. Others spoke of gratitude for the courage it took to write, for the chance to read and remember. One student, a recent immigrant, said she saw her own family's journey reflected in Josiah's words.
He wrote so his children would know who he was. My parents did the same, in a different language, in a different land. We all want to be remembered. The professor encouraged the students to write their own letters, to add their voices to the growing archive. Some wrote to Josiah, others to their ancestors, still others to the future. The act of writing became a ritual, a way of claiming space in the ongoing story of hope and resistance. The museum staff collected these letters, adding them to the wall of remembrance, where they joined thousands of others, a living testament to the power of words.
Meanwhile, the letter continued to inspire new forms of art and activism. A playwright adapted Josiah's story for the stage, weaving together his words with music and movement. The play premiered to sold-out audiences, its final scene a tableau of actors standing in silence, each holding a copy of the letter. The audience, moved to tears, rose in a standing ovation. Critics praised the play for its honesty, its refusal to offer easy answers, and its insistence on the complexity of history. In another city, a muralist painted Josiah's words on the side of a school, the letters 10 feet high and visible for blocks. The mural became a landmark, a gathering place for protests and celebrations alike. Children walked past it on their way to class, some pausing to trace the letters with their fingers, others reciting the words from memory. The muralist, herself a descendant of enslaved people, said she wanted the letter to be impossible to ignore, a reminder that we are all part of this story. The letter's influence reached into the halls of power as well. Lawmakers cited Josiah's words in debates over reparations, over the teaching of history, and over the meaning of justice in a divided nation. Some resisted, insisting that the past was best left undisturbed, but others argued that Josiah's letter was a call to action, a demand that the nation reckon with its history and strive for something better. The debates were fierce, the outcomes uncertain, but the letter's presence was undeniable, a voice from the past insisting on its place in the present. For the descendants of Josiah's family, the letter remained a source of pride and reflection. Family reunions became occasions for reading the letter aloud, for sharing stories and memories, for honoring the courage of those who had come before. Some descendants became activists, others teachers, artists, or simply keepers of the story. All felt the weight of Josiah's words, the responsibility to ensure that his legacy endured. In quiet moments, visitors to the museum sometimes found themselves alone with the letter, the gallery empty but for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of footsteps. In those moments, the letter seemed to speak directly, its message as urgent and necessary as it had been on the night it was written. "I am a man," Josiah had written. "I have loved and lost and hoped." The words lingered, a reminder that the act of speaking, of refusing to be silenced, was itself a form of hope. As the sun set over the city, the museum's lights dimmed, but the letter remained, illuminated in its case, a beacon for all who sought to understand the past and imagine a better future. Its journey was not over. Each new reader, each new voice became part of the story, a story of courage, of memory, and the enduring power of the written word. The final chapter of Josiah's letter was not written by him, but by those who came after. It was written in the quiet moments when a child paused to read his words, in the tears shed by a stranger who saw their own pain reflected in his story, in the defiant stand of an activist who invoked his name as a rallying cry. The letter had become more than a document. It was a living thing, shaped and reshaped by each hand that touched it, each voice that spoke it aloud. In the museum, curators began to notice a pattern. Visitors who spent time with the letter often returned, sometimes months or even years later. Some brought friends, others brought family. A few came alone, sitting quietly before the display, as if seeking solace or guidance. One woman, who visited every year on the anniversary of her mother's death, left a note. "Your words helped me find my way back to myself." Another, a young man struggling with depression, wrote, "You gave me hope when I had none." The museum staff, recognizing the letter's power, created a special space for reflection, a small room lined with benches and soft lighting, where visitors could sit and write, think, or simply be still. On the walls, they hung quotes from Josiah's letter, each framed in simple wood, each accompanied by a brief explanation of its context. "I have not forgotten how to dream," one read. "Let it be known that I am a man," another. The room became a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world faded away, replaced by the quiet hum of memory and hope. Outside the museum, the letter continued to inspire new generations. In schools, teachers used it to spark conversations about empathy and justice. In churches, pastors wove it into sermons about resilience and redemption. In community centers, activists cited it in calls for change. Each time, the letter seemed to gather new meaning, its message adapting to the needs of the moment while remaining true to its core.
For some, the letter was a source of comfort. For others, it was a challenge, a demand to confront uncomfortable truths, to question the stories they had been told, to imagine a different kind of world. The letter did not offer easy answers, nor did it shy away from the complexity of history. Instead, it invited readers to engage, to reflect, to act. It reminded them that the past was not a distant land, but a living force, shaping the present in ways both visible and unseen. As the years passed, the letter's influence grew, reaching far beyond the borders of the United States. In South Africa, activists fighting against apartheid found inspiration in Josiah's words. In India, Dalit writers cited the letter as an example of the power of testimony. In Ireland, poets drew parallels between Josiah's struggle and their own history of colonization and resistance. The letter became a global symbol, its message of dignity and defiance resonating across cultures and continents. Yet, for all its public acclaim, the letter retained a deeply personal resonance. Those who read it often described a sense of intimacy, as if Josiah were speaking directly to them across the gulf of years. His words, stripped of pretense or artifice, carried the weight of lived experience, the ache of longing, the sting of loss, the stubborn flicker of hope. Readers found themselves drawn into his world, compelled to bear witness to his pain and his courage. In the quiet of the museum, beneath the soft glow of the display lights, Josiah's letter waited for each new reader. Some approached with reverence, others with curiosity. All left changed, touched by the courage of a man who had dared to write the truth, even when the world was not ready to hear it. The letter's journey was not over. Each new reader, each new voice became part of the story, a story of courage, of memory, of the enduring power of the written word. And so Josiah's letter lived on, not as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future. Its words, written in the darkness of a Virginia night, continued to shine, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the act of speaking, of refusing to be silenced, was itself a form of hope. The letter's final chapter was not written by Josiah, but by those who came after, and it was still being written.